Welcome to Homegrown History with Limestone County archivist Rebekah Davis and longtime Athens, Alabama native Richard Martin. Each episode, Richard and Rebekah bring to life some of the famous and infamous stories etched in Limestone County's rich history.
Hello and welcome back to Homegrown History, your Limestone County history podcast. I am Rebekah Davis, the archivist at the Limestone County Archives in Athens, Alabama. I'm here with my co-host.
I'm Richard Martin, the oldest one here.
That's right. And we are joined once again with our guests, Peggy Towns from Decatur and Steve Brown from Auburn, to continue the discussion of the Scottsboro Boys case that affected Athens and Decatur and obviously Scottsboro. Peggy and Steve have both written books about this case. And if you want to know a little bit more, before you even listen any further, go back and listen to part 1 of this episode because you want to know what all happened. But Peggy, Steve, we appreciate y'all joining us again.
Thank you.
Just to recap, so in a nutshell, the case of the Scottsboro Boys was the case of 9 young black men who were charged with raping 2 white women on a train going through Jackson County in 1931, and were all found guilty. And then new trials were ordered on the grounds of incompetent defense in the first trials in Scottsboro. The case was sent to Decatur, Alabama, Morgan County, and Judge James Edwin Horton Jr. from Athens-Limestone County, was circuit court judge, was tapped to preside over this case.
He was the judge for Limestone, Morgan, Lawrence, and Coleman.
Correct.
Right,
So
the entire circuit. That's right. Well-known, well-loved person from a well-known, well-loved family here in Limestone County, known for his eye toward justice, we'll say. But also, as we mentioned, not necessarily set out to be a civil rights hero. He was from a prominent white family that had help and on back had slaves. But the family motto, which I did not really talk about in the first part of this episode, was let justice be done though the heavens may fall. And that's something that he learned and carried through with him. So we discussed about the first retrial of these young men was that of Haywood Patterson in March and April of 1933. And when we left off, we had gone through all the testimony and Judge Horton's charge to the jury. And
let me
yes.
just jump in because, and Steve, you had mentioned Ruby Bates' dress, but Knight also poked fun at Carter's dress as well. And one of the things he said, if you acquit this Negro, put a garland of roses around his neck, give him a supper and send him to the New York City, they'll let Dr. Harry Fosdick dress him up.
Yes.
In a high hat and morning coat, gray striped trousers and spats. This is what will happen.
Wow. Well, and you mentioned when we were in the break between our first and second parts of this episode, what Haywood Patterson said on the stand himself.
Yes, when they were asking him, well, weren't you tried in Scottsboro? He said, no, I was framed in Scottsboro.
That's right. And so over the course of the trial, it really became pretty evident that he was indeed being framed. However, there was an all-white, all-male jury. And when we left off, Judge Horton had just sent the case to the jury to deliberate. So on April 8th, 1933, well, actually, it was April 7th that he sent to deliberate. So they deliberated over the evening of April 7th. And part of their deliberations included putting together a jigsaw puzzle. And there is a picture at the Morgan County Archives of these men all in their suits and ties with big smiles crowded around their jigsaw puzzle that they so proudly made while they were deliberating this man's life, this young man's life. And in addition to showing off their jigsaw puzzle, the jury foreman handed Judge Horton a piece of paper upon which had been written in large penciled letters, "We find the defendant guilty as charged," and fixed the punishment as death in the electric chair. So that's where we are at the end of this trial. But that's not the end of the story, is it?
No.
One of you want to talk about what happened next?
Well, I will just briefly, in terms of the timeline, Judge Horton, as presiding judge, taking the recommendation of the jury, goes ahead and sets a sentence of death for Patterson initially, and then that's, of course, appealed by his defense counsel. He's going to go ahead with seeking a new motion, so he puts everything on hold and says, we're going to go ahead and I'll decide whether or not to grant your motion for a new trial, but let's just put all the rest of these trials for these other young men on hold. The emotion and the drama and everything is just so upside down right now. It's just not a good environment in order to seek justice.
That's right. And part of the reason he put it on hold was because of what Leibowitz said. It's not funny, but it's kind of funny what he said in the I'm going to shuffle papers just for a minute because I want to read this. While I'm doing that, Peggy, you want to talk about what was going on in Decatur during all of this?
Well, of course, things were contentious, as you might know. You had already mentioned about the white supremacists trying to come in. The black community had been threatened as well because, their jobs were at livelihood. Their families were threatened. And see, one of the things that Leibowitz had in his meeting with the blacks was that he asked that they show up in court every day. And they did. And so therefore, because they worked for whites, their livelihood was threatened. Their families were threatened. And in my book, I list a lot of the testimony, a lot of the whites that, we don't even need to have a trial. We just need to have some rope here.
Right.
And so, I talk about a lot of that in my book as well.
You talked some about some of the intimidation tactics that were used during the trial. Do you want to go into that just a little bit?
Well, actually, it irks me still when I think about everything. But for many of the blacks, it was one woman, her boss just asked, well, what do you think about the trial? And she told her, well, I think they're innocent. She got fired. And so it's tactics like that. And after Judge Horton made his ruling, and prior to the next trial, there was what I call a deja vu moment where another black man was accused of raping a white woman. And there was a lynching. Young man, Klan went down Vine Street. Young man was delivering medicine to Dr. Sherritt's house, and he was shot off his bicycle.
Wow. Terrible.
Yes.
So it was a frightening time, I'm sure, to be a black person living in Decatur and Morgan County while all of this was going on. And what Leibowitz said that really kind of inflamed everything and even earned Judge Horton a letter from Joel Brown of the Supreme Court of Alabama with this clipping enclosed. Samuel Leibowitz, the defense lawyer from New York, went back to New York after filing the motion for the new trial. He said, if you ever saw those, he's talking about the jury and the people of Alabama. If you ever saw those creatures, those bigots, whose mouths are slits in their faces, whose eyes pop out at you like a frog's, whose chins drip tobacco juice, bewhiskered and filthy, you would not ask how they could do it. When I got back home, I felt that I needed a moral, mental, and physical bath. And so Joel Brown included the clipping with just a note that says, the enclosed appears to be a sound suggestion, and for this reason I'm forwarding it to you. And the suggestion was, Mr. Leibowitz doesn't need to come back. And this trial, retrial, or any sort of new trial, because the next one was Charlie Weems, wasn't it, that was scheduled to take place. He said, this needs to be postponed until there can be a change of venue, until all this heated passions can chill out a little bit. I'm using 2021 words, not 1934 words, but that was the gist of it. And so, of course, April 8th is when the guilty verdict was handed down. April 17th, so 9 days later, it should have been a very routine event for Judge Horton to set the sentence of death for Haywood Patterson. However, instead of setting an execution date, he suspended it on the motion for a new trial. He postponed the trial of the next defendant, Charlie Weems, and the rest of the Scottsboro Boys, and he said he could not prevent outside influences from affecting the jury. So with that, of course, these young men were all still, they were in prison in Birmingham, weren't they?
No, at Kilby. They brought them to Birmingham for the trial in Decatur. So they were only brought to Birmingham to go to trial in Decatur.
So then you had like this kind of lull, don't you, from April to June of 1933, where there's not really a whole lot of action going on. Maybe, of course, some things behind the scenes. But Judge Horton, of course, has postponed the execution date, and he's going over all of this testimony and so on. And of course, you've got Samuel Leibowitz is writing in to say, look, anything I said is nowhere near as inflammatory as what, Knight has said. And he wrote this 3-page letter to Judge Horton, and he said, let me just tell you about the prejudice. He's like, it started when those poor unfortunates were hurried through the machinery of justice at Scottsboro to the tune of There'll Be a Hot Time in Old Town Tonight. And he went on, because the Negroes were excluded from the jury, and there were pamphlets that were being handed out at the Decatur courtroom saying that the Negroes are going to receive their just deserts, death in the electric chair. This one killed me. It says, the prejudice was intensified by the Attorney General, Thomas Knight, when he applauded vociferously with his hands, leaped in the air like a frenzied rooter at a football game, and shouted with glee at a point which he thought that a witness had made that was favorable to the prosecution. And of course he goes on and talks about, we don't call, and he used the N-word to corroborate a white witness, no matter who the white witness may be. And he's like, anything I did was no comparison to the prejudice that already existed.
The N-word or negri.
Yes.
Negris, those are the terms that he used all during the trial.
Yes. Yeah. And just basically, like I said in the first part of this episode, kind of made them out to be basically like animals. Now, among the letters that Judge Horton was receiving during this time, he was getting positive and negative letters. One of the things he got was a fan letter from the KKK. And that's in the lard bucket as well. Beautiful header, by the way. Beautiful, what am I trying to say? Not header, but...
Letterhead.
Letterhead, thank you. And they were praising Judge Horton for handling the trial so well because they were happy with the guilty verdict. And then, of course, you had these different editorials, pro and con and so on. So we get to June 22nd, 1933. Go ahead.
As you said, what's happening or the lull, all of this is the motion for new trials. So all these telegrams, everything else like that, they're directed towards Judge Horton about, are you going to grant this new trial? Okay, yes. Do it again, or are we going to accept what the jury already set forth, which he could have easily done, just washed his hands of it. So what's happening in this lull is this decision of whether he should grant a new trial or not.
Exactly. And also change the venue to Birmingham.
That's right.
That was something that a lot of people wanted. I know in one of the earliest letters, there was a group that said they would get a whole lot more justice in Birmingham, fair justice in Birmingham than in Decatur. What it said, way out there in the woods, in the center of mob rule. That's what they said Decatur was, the center of mob rule.
And you have to keep in mind, they also thought that if they had a Southern lawyer,
yes,
they would be represented better.
Right, exactly. And there may have been some truth to that, because I know
that Charlie Watts did come in, remember?
Yeah, that's true.
An attorney from Huntsville.
That's true. When you read
Clarence
through
Watts, I'm sorry.
Yes, when you read through just all of the letters and the editorials and, a lot of it was this sort of resentment that someone was coming in from outside telling them what to do. That sort of South versus North, big city New York. There was sort of that attitude. But like you said, really, I think the writing was on the wall, regardless of who was defending these young men. So, anything else we want to mention before we get to June 22nd?
No, I think that we should have mentioned, even back in Scottsboro, is that the penalty for rape was 10 years to life.
Yes.
10 years to death penalty, I should say. They had the opportunity in Scottsboro and also in Decatur, the juries, to have anywhere on that spectrum. And so to immediately go to the extreme penalty for rape and have it be death is something that's always jumped out to me. And even in Judge Anderson's dissent from the Alabama Supreme Court, what came out of Scottsboro, he said, you look at this whole array of young men, the impossibility that some of them could have even participated, and you didn't consider whether or not in that range of 10 years to death penalty, why always go to the extreme? So,
and I think we have to also remember that the electrocution came about because that was their way of doing legal lynchings. Right. There had been so much about lynchings being held in the state. Yep. And all blacks actually received death penalty for such a case.
Yep. Exactly. Well, and if you look at the timing of this, lynchings, there's a lynching database in Tuskegee University, and all of the known lynchings in, U.S. history. And you start to see a precipitous drop in lynchings, illegal lynchings, right about the time you see Yellow Mama come into use.
Correct.
And these boys kind of got caught in that transition to legal lynchings. And I mean, that's a whole nother podcast for a whole nother day, but it was sort of the start of using the justice system to achieve the same ends. So, okay, June 22nd. It was a hot day in Athens, Alabama. Judge Horton just lived 1 block north of the Limestone County Courthouse, where his courtroom was. In fact, it's still there to this day. In fact, Peggy and I sat at the bench back in 2020, and we talked about this case for a video, which actually is still on YouTube if anybody wants to see more about that. So, he stepped out, walked the block south in his 3-piece suit and boots to the Limestone County Courthouse. He climbed up the marble steps to his courtroom, sat down at his bench, and he started reading. It took him 65 minutes just to read his decision. Page after handwritten page of evidence, just laid out. I mean, he was a doctor and a lawyer, and he laid it out. We will not go through 65 minutes of reading that today. All leading up
to... Go ahead and tell him what he wrote at the top, though.
You remind me.
He wrote the family motto at the top.
Oh, that's right. In case you forgot, let justice be done.
Though the heavens may fall.
Though the heavens may fall. And so, but when you get down to the very bottom line, he said that history, sacred and profane, and the common experience of mankind teaches that women of the character shown in this case are prone for selfish reasons to make false accusations both of rape and of insult upon the slightest provocation or even without provocation for ulterior purposes. The court will not pursue the evidence any further. The testimony of the prosecutrix, which is, of course, Victoria Price and Review Bates, in this case is not only uncorroborated, but it bears on its face indications of improbability and is contradicted by other evidence. And in addition thereto, the evidence greatly preponderates in favor of the defendant. It therefore becomes the duty of this court under the law to grant the motion made in this case, which that was the motion to throw out the verdict. And it is therefore ordered and adjudged by the court that the motion be granted, that the verdict of the jury in this case and the judgment of the court sentencing this defendant to death be set aside, and that a new trial is hereby ordered. This June 22nd, 1933, James E. Horton, Circuit Judge. So that was a huge shock. No one expected Judge Horton, of all people, to throw the whole thing out and order a whole new trial.
And it's fairly rare. I mean, it's one thing to have a judgment and then appeal that to a higher court, but to have at that trial level for the judge to say, we all heard the exact same thing. You guys came to a different conclusion than I did, and I'm just going to go ahead and throw what you came up with out, and let's do it again.
Exactly.
Very, very unusual. Again, he very easily could have just rolled with it, let it go upon appeal, let the Alabama Supreme Court deal with it, but he chose to step in and make a statement with his ruling and setting aside the jury's verdict. And it's a pretty courageous thing he did.
Right. And not only was it unusual, is it still unusual for that to happen? For a white man to take the testimony and the word of a black man over a jury of white men was completely unheard of, wasn't it?
And, when we look at the George, the case, we see courage.
Wait, which case? Oh, the
George Floyd.
Yes.
In that case, it just took a lot of courage.
Yes.
Even today, for that decision to be made.
Exactly.
And particularly with a police officer.
Oh, of course. Yes. Well, and it's interesting to me to read the Alabama Courier, which was one of the 2 newspapers in Limestone County at the time. They just had a small little blip about it next to a big story about a judge dying. And they said that for the 3rd time, Haywood Patterson was given a new trial. And it said the judge had already made up his mind and didn't allow any argument, but at once began the reading of his opinion, which was lengthy. And at the conclusion, he announced that the verdict of the Morgan County jury was set aside. and a new trial was granted the defendant. And it says, the court held that its mind was made up and there was nothing that could change it. In his brief, he practically declared none of the 9 Negroes guilty. What will follow this decision, we do not know. Evidently, there must have been some sort of crime, or there would not have been such an uprising of public opinion. I think that's an interesting statement on, obviously, if there's something must have happened here, or everybody wouldn't be so up in arms. And of course, you had several people continuing to write in and say, watch your back. You're grass. So that kind of brings us to the aftermath of this. And for Haywood Patterson, he still had to be tried again. And Alabama
second death sentence.
Yes, that's right. The Alabama Supreme Court removed Horton from the case, and they gave it to William Callahan from Coleman.
Actually, he's from Lawrence County.
Oh, was he?
A known white supremacist.
Well, Haywood Patterson said he could, later in his memoirs, he said he couldn't get me to the chair fast enough. It was very quickly found
And see,
guilty.
he earned the name Speedy Callahan because of his promptness in he said, I'm going to debunk these cases and get them off the front pages of our newspapers. And during Haywood Patterson's third trial, he did not even give the jury he did not instruct them properly. And so Leibowitz had to in turn tell them, well, look, you did not tell them how to decide the cases.
Right, exactly. And now Callahan presided over all of the retrials for the rest of them. And they were very quickly, within less than a year, all of them were found guilty again. And then the Supreme Court again reversed the convictions in 1935 because black jurors were excluded from
systematic exclusion.
Right. Tell about the names that were written at the bottom of the jury roll, Peggy. You've seen that.
Yes, they've actually struck out names and put them in red. And so then they had a handwriting expert to come in, and he said, these names have been put in here, but
they were added after the fact.
Absolutely, and initially, even the jury commissioner said, I don't think blacks can actually discern the fate of anybody. And he said, I've not taken the time to go around. He said, well, I put in all the whites. He said, I've not even taken the time to see what black might qualify. So that was one of the things, that was considered.
And as I mentioned in the first part, the rest of these boys' lives were just really a nightmare. Even Patterson was again convicted in 1936.
But Rebekah, after the Supreme Court ruling came back, then that meant that Alabama had to fill their jury boxes, called the Welch Jury Bill, with the names of blacks. Creed Conyers was the first with the grand jury. And then Morgan County, I found some names of some of my neighbors, and I had no idea.
Really?
Yes, had no idea that they were involved.
Wow.
Period, with the Scottsboro Boys.
Did you ever get to talk to them?
Not about they're all deceased now, but there were people that I knew. Actually, one of the men lived across the street from me, but I never heard them say anything about the trial.
Right. Well, and it was one of those things, I'm sure they kind of maybe felt like, let sleeping dogs lie, didn't they?
Well, and I knew that my grandmother attended the trial, but all she used to say was, I attended the Scottsboro Boys trial. But young, you didn't ask any questions about it. I wish I had now.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing that you have that personal connection to the Scottsboro Boys case.
Oh, and my dad actually lived in Jackson County when this happened. And you have to keep in mind Victoria Price and Ruby Bates initially said that there were 6 on me. It was 12. There were 6 on me and 6 on her.
Oh.
That was the initial testimony. But my dad lived in Jackson County when this happened, and he recalled the sheriff coming in. He said they just burst in their doors looking for the other 3.
Oh, wow. Did they come to your dad's?
To every house around there in that area. And also, there was out of this trial, there was one black man for the prosecution, and his name was Sam Mitchell. And I found him because I had gone to Stevenson one day, and I was talking to some neighbors, And he asked me what was I writing. I said, I'm trying to finish this book on the Scottsboro Boys trial. He said, well, my granddaddy was involved in it. I said, huh? So here I am thinking, well, was he one of those that got away?
Right.
And during my research, I found Sam Mitchell was one of the persons who testified for the prosecutor.
Wow.
That's wild. He was a black man who testified on behalf of the prosecution.
Mm-hmm. He and the person that he worked for supposedly saw the fight.
Okay.
Well, saw the people on the train.
Was that the ones who... I know in the Haywood Patterson's trial, there was a farmer or somebody who said, oh, yeah, I saw what was going on. But he was like...
He did not see
200
that.
yards away. Or something.
No, that was not him. But a local photographer took pictures of his farm. And that's how they concluded that there is no way that he could have seen what he saw.
Exactly. Once again, it's just some of that evidence. It's what was presented as evidence that really didn't prove anything. Well, in 1937... Go ahead.
Just real quick. When Harry Patterson was convicted again, he wasn't sentenced to death in 1936.
Right.
He was sentenced to 75 years in prison, but that apparently was the first time that an African-American convicted of rape of two white women had not gotten the death penalty. So that, in that sense, that is significant.
But
He got 75 years.
Yep.
Well, as we'll talk about in just a minute, he actually didn't serve life in prison because, so 1937, the state dropped charges against 4 of them.
Five.
It was 5. 4 were released.
Yes.
Yes. Ozzie Powell was not released because, he had cut the deputy in Coleman.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, I thought it was odd. They carried the deputy to the Coleman hospital. Well, of course, the sheriff had shot Ozzie Powell in the head.
Oh, wow.
And they carried him to Birmingham to get treated.
Yeah.
But he served 20 years
For assault.
because of that.
Yeah.
So he was not released during the no pros.
But the rape charges were dropped.
Yes.
Right. Well, and all of them had been pardoned by 1950, hadn't they? That's what I have in my notes. Is that correct?
Well,
There's no pardon if charges are dropped.
Charges were dropped. Okay.
Yeah. Actually, the 5, they received no pros.
Right.
But, the judge told them not to ever set foot back in the state of Alabama.
Oh, okay. Well, and Patterson, to me, is just such a heartbreak because he was in prison until 1947, and I mean, just a violent life. There was fights, attempts on his life, and he broke out in 1947, and he fled to Michigan, wrote a book. They tried to extradite him back to Alabama, and Michigan refused. And but he ended up back in prison, charged with manslaughter. And in 1952, he died of cancer. He was only 39 years old.
I just went back to prison.
Yeah, 39 years old. It's just sad to me. There's a picture in those Morgan County records of him and his mama, and the looks on their faces, is during the trial. It's heartbreaking. Like, I got boys. When I think about it, it's just heartbreaking.
And Rebekah, you have to keep in mind, the parents were not allowed to visit them in Scottsboro, nor were they allowed to visit them in prison.
So really, the only time they really were able to be with them was there at the trial. Hearing all of this, it's just heartbreaking to think about. Well, and then you've got Judge Horton, like you said, let justice be done though the heavens may fall. In some ways, it did fall for him. He ran for re-election in 1934 and lost.
But he won Limestone County and won the city of Athens. He lost in the other counties.
That's right. In fact, several of the local lawyers and residents did take out an ad supporting him. Mm-hmm. But, with the entire circuit, as you mentioned, Lawrence and Coleman and everything, overall, he lost. He never did return to the courtroom.
He lost in the primary. It wasn't the general election. He lost in the primary. And I think he'd run unopposed the 2 previous times he ran. So public opinion very much
political suicide.
It's right. That's exactly what it was. It was political suicide. And not only did he never return to court, he actually up and moved out of Athens. He picked up his house, not physically picked it up himself, but the antebellum home that was there where Athens City Hall is now, he had it moved down to Greenbrier, and he raised Black Angus cattle for the rest of his days. And, he actually told the jury, I've done what I thought to be right, no matter what the personal cost to me, might be. And it's kind of a postscript. It's interesting that where that house is now, which was way out in the country in Greenbrier in the middle of a cow field, is now right across from the Toyota Mazda plant. And the family is looking at moving it again. And we don't know yet where it's going to go. There's been some debate from what I understand, so we'll just leave it at that. But now it's not in that pastoral scene that it once was. It's right there on Greenbrier Parkway. It is still right next to Greenbrier Barbecue, though, so there is that. And Richard, you knew Judge Horton personally, didn't you?
I didn't know him, but when I was a teenager, I would see him, and I knew who he was. That's all I knew.
And knew him because he was Judge Horton of the Scottsboro Boys?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Well, that's because he's Judge Horton.
What was kind of the general feeling, by the time you knew him as an older man, what was the kind of general feeling in the community of his character and so on?
His character is great, and his way of life was great, and his children were great. He had great children. And even the grandchildren, what they're doing today is great, what they're doing for our community.
That's right. Well, and Kathy Horton Garrett, who is his granddaughter, who he lived with her in the last years of his life in that home in Greenbrier, she has been very actively involved in the efforts that have honored him in most recent years, which I want to come back to. But first, I want to mention the aftermath with the rest of the Scottsboro Boys, because there is, I don't know if you say it's a happy ending. For most of them, they had really rough lives even after they got out of prison. I know one actually committed suicide. They had
Right.
He killed his
Right.
wife and then committed suicide.
He actually seemed to have the best life. He got kind of adopted by some African American celebrities. Had some schooling paid for. Joined the Coast Guard, the Merchant Marine. I can't remember what.
Marines,
Yeah,
I think it was.
and seemed to be on the right track. Came back from a tour of duty and believed that his wife was having an affair, and killed her, shot himself. And Andy Wright, his older brother, had kind of got his life squared away, but when he came to identify the body, people were like, oh, you're that Andy Wright of the Scottsboro Boys. And then he was evicted from his home and all these different things. And he gave an interview to the Black Press saying, 2 weeks ago, nobody knew who I was and my life was on track. Now Scottsboro's come back up. And I think he died like 3 years later. Just things like that. And anyway, it's just very, very sad.
So it only took until 2013, 80 years later? Am I doing the math right? Before something sort of changed. Sheila Washington was actually really active and involved in this effort to have these boys granted posthumous pardons. And Sheila, she actually died. It was this year, wasn't it? This past January that she died, I believe. She was in Scottsboro. She actually established a Scottsboro Boys Museum there in Scottsboro, not far from the Unclaimed Baggage Center in an old church. And it was open by appointment. I think it still is. But she sort of spearheaded the effort to have these boys granted, the Scottsboro Boys granted posthumous pardons. And of course, Patterson versus Alabama is to this day a landmark U.S. Supreme Court case that set the precedent that for black defendants, the jury pool must include black jurors. And so there are some positive notes from this.
But I think prior to you going there, you have to remember in 1976, Governor Wallace pardoned Clarence Norris.
That's right.
2013 it was Hayward Patterson, Charlie Weems, and Andy Wright, the only three that had not either had the charges dropped or been pardoned earlier.
Right. And all of their family was on hand, and Governor Bentley signed the order. And so we'll kind of wrap up by talking about some of the commemorations that have been done. One was in June 22nd, 2017, Judge Horton Day was declared in Athens, Alabama. And there was an event to raise money for the monument that was being crafted. And we also had in this library, the Athens-Limestone Public Library, an exhibit that included the photos from Horton County. Yes, and Peggy spoke at that, and she did an excellent job, as you can imagine, having heard her today. And but the pens, so the Horton family still has the pen that Judge Horton used to write his decision, and they also have the pen that Governor Bentley used to sign the pardons. And so we had those on display here. I thought that was, pretty cool. And so speaking of the monument, if you go to the west side, the main entrance of the Limestone County Courthouse now, there is the likeness of Judge Horton in bronze right there at the entrance with a marker, a historic marker that tells the story. And the Judge Horton Monument Project was undertaken it was all privately funded.
I was on that committee, and we had no problem raising money for that. It was something $75,000.
That's right. The Limestone County Bar Association kind of spearheaded that effort, and Richard and I were on that committee. We helped plan that Judge Horton Day, and yeah, it was all just local funds that were raised to honor one of our own. And then, let's see, a couple years ago, the Athens Post Office was renamed the Judge James Edwin Horton Jr., or the James Edwin Horton Jr. U.S. Post Office in Athens, Alabama. In fact, I went in there to mail off a package to my sister just yesterday, and there's a picture there at the entrance with his quote about, justice. And so those sort of things have been done here in Athens. And then, as we mentioned, Peggy has a book, Scottsboro Unmasked.
Decatur
Story. And Steve has a book. He has written about it.
Just the Scottsboro Boys is one of the chapters in my book of great Supreme Court cases from
right.
Alabama. It's called
Alabama Justice.
Alabama Justice.
Right.
But also, we erected an Alabama historical marker, I believe it was 2018, 19, at the Morgan County Courthouse.
Yeah, and there have been books and movies. Dan Carter wrote one of the really great overviews of the case. And PBS did a documentary about the Scottsboro Boys. One thing that always struck me, that's kind of just a funny little thing in that documentary, was these two old timers standing out there in paint rock at the railroad tracks. They said, this is about where it took place. And they said, we just wish that train would have gone about 200 yards on down the line, because then they would have been in Madison County, and then they would have been the Huntsville Boys. Because for the most part, Scottsboro has not wanted to be. The general consensus in Scottsboro is that they have not wanted their name to be connected to this case.
And the courthouse where these trials were held is still there in Jackson County.
Yes.
But also, one of the things that I like to talk about too is that in Decatur, we're hoping to soon have a Scottsboro Boys Civil Rights Museum. So it will not just entail the Scottsboro Boys story, but other civil rights cases as well.
That would be so great. Do you know yet where it might be?
Yes, actually we have the building. It just needs some restoration. So we're in the process of raising funds.
Who would somebody need to talk to find out more information about that, or to donate funds?
Just contact the Scottsboro Boys Ciota Museum Foundation, and there's a link on the Facebook and on the webpage site.
If they go to Facebook, is it Scottsboro Boys Ciota, C-E-O-T-A, which stands for Celebrating
Early Old Town with Art.
That's it. I knew you were involved with that as well. Let's see, there was also a made-for-TV movie that came out in the 1970s.
I saw it. I remember seeing it.
About Judge Horton and the Scottsboro Boys. Yeah, how well was that received back then?
I enjoyed it.
But they Victoria Price and Ruby Bates sued.
Ruby Bates died shortly thereafter, but Victoria Price sued NBC.
That's right.
People thought she died. When she saw how she was characterized in that movie, she came out and they settled. I don't know what the amount was, but I think her attorney said this is enough to keep her happy for the rest of her life or something.
And it's one of the things that really did not come up in the trial much, but she had been married. Right. Victoria Price had been married a couple of times. Actually, she was married when the trial started and dating someone else's husband.
Yes.
Which
was also illegal in Alabama at the time.
Yep.
It still is.
Is it still illegal in the book? I look at the old record book, the old jail registers in Limestone County. I mean, we know it's immoral. I just didn't know if it was actually illegal, if you could get arrested for that. But yeah, some of these old record books, you see people arrested for adultery, for using abusive language in the presence of a woman, all sorts of things. So I'm trying to think if there's any other, the Rhodes Scholar. So Steve and I have gone around the state to actually it's basically like sensitivity training, but for law enforcement in different areas of the state, where we take a deeper dive into this case and learn the lessons that can be applied to today, because, uneven justice is still an issue, as we know, to this day in the United States of America.
Scales will not balance at times.
And so we were able to kind of dive into this lesson of history versus them watching some sort of training video saying, do this, don't do that. So I thought that was a great opportunity. You can also go to the Alabama Humanities Alliance YouTube page, I have a presentation called Judge Horton and the Pen Strokes of Justice, Judge Horton and the Scottsboro Boys, where I delve more deeply into Judge Horton's role in the case and the lard bucket and all. And that's up on YouTube through the Alabama Humanities Alliance. They recorded it last year. And then, as I mentioned, Steve and I are working on a book, so be on the lookout for that. Anything else we need to add? Thank you for joining us today.
I couldn't say anything. It was so good. Each one of you just.
Well, we appreciate all of us for being here today, and most of all, we appreciate you all for listening. So, with that, please join us next time for another episode of Homegrown History.
You've been listening to Homegrown History, presented by the Athens-Limestone County Public Library and the Limestone County Archives in Athens, Alabama. For more information and to submit questions or suggestions, please visit limestonearchives.com. And to hear other recordings from our Library Voices series, check out our website at alcpl.org. You can also listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.